Hi, Misha here, and over the past week or so, really have tried to give people some videos that they've been asking for, mainly AKs, mainly that WBP, so I hope you enjoyed it. And that's just part of my sincere thanks for the recent outswelling of support. Again, financial helps a lot, Patreon, super thanks on YouTube here. But if you can't, I get it, holidays. My wife and I were just talking today about things we'd like to do, like a air purifier that just can't quite afford. Anyway, doesn't matter. But please do like and subscribe and comment. Those cost you nothing, not even much time, and they really do help on YouTube these days. Please do that. So, Thanksgiving, I did a video on the Arisaka because it's something I really enjoy, and there are at least enough comments saying, hey, my Arisaka videos help. In that video, I talked about the early generations, Type 30, 35, 38, Type 40 carbine, excuse me, 44 carbine, and kind of pre-World War I and through World War I. Pretty much everything made it Tokyo. But in this video, for Black Friday, we're going to talk about how T-38 production continued and how the rifles changed, the end of the Tokyo arsenal, what replaced it, Japan's kind of changing position in the world and why that happened. Remember, they were on the side of the Allies in World War I, why they switched to the Axis in World War II. And how we went from something like this, 6.5, I'm just being careful because this is so long, to the whole series here, something like this, which is a relatively late production substitute Type 99, last ditch, and this is a Nagoya Series 9, pretty uncommon variation. And of course this is in 7.7 millimeter. And while this isn't really a truly Arisaka, because as we discussed in the first video, his design was pretty much dropped by the series of guns between the 35 and 38. It is very close to the 38, but also not. We'll get there. But before we start talking about what's really becoming a popular collectible for folks today, the 99 Arisakas, let's go back and kind of finish the story on the original 6.5 millimeter guns. Picking our story back up with the Type 38 long rifle. As I said in the first part, production would absolutely continue after the Great War, World War I. And this would be, and yes, this is very long and I'm going to hit the swing. What do you do? Production would continue at the Tokyo Artillery Arsenal. However, in 1923 there was the Great Kanto earthquake, and that halted production there and in many places in Japan and reorganized resources. So things slowed throughout the 20s, and for all kinds of technical, administrative, regional differences and reasons, the old arsenal at Koshika was being slowly shut down in the late 20s and early 30s. And they would stop turning out Type 38s around 1931, 1932. But it would actually very smoothly transition over to what we know as Kokora, even using the same cannonball symbol, which has led to much confusion for collectors over the years. But they would start using Tokyo parts at Kokora for assembly. You really see this with a lot of handguns and stuff too. I digress. But Kokora would kind of pick up directly from there. And I should also say that not only supplying the Japanese Army and Navy, but they also started exporting and doing contracts. We briefly mentioned in part 1 the Siamese Mauser. Well, in 1924, Siam ordered a special batch of Arisaka Type 38s chambered for 8x52, and these are called Type 66s in Siam. And then, in 1940, Japan would send just standard Type 38s to Siam. And other nations would get them as well. And of course, Japan had been occupying Korea really since the end of the Russo-Japanese War, and would begin occupying parts of China, Manchuria, the like, in the 1920s, and that war would blow wide open by the 1930s. So, this is our original Type 38 long rifle with the notch sight, unprotected front, smooth straight butt plate, and the convex safety, amongst others. Pointing those out because here, I wonder if I can just set this in front of the camera. I'm still kind of working out methodologies. Yeah, especially with these long guns. Yeah, that might work. We'll see. Here is a later production example, but just some production changes that crept in. Kind of maybe most obvious, we have a cupped butt plate now. This was done because of this two-piece stock to kind of keep it together better. These will separate, especially the straight butt plates, over time. The one you just looked at, I had to fix years ago. They're easy to fix, but it's just, the wood dries out and shrinks. So it's the type of wood they used. It also kind of kept the toes of the stock from getting damaged. Made sense. Remember, we have these here to kind of keep the wrist protected, so yeah. Next, the safety went to a concave notch versus convex. And the rear sight went to a very visible peep in both positions, both adjustable and in the battle sight. And the front sight now has protective ears like the carbines. Pretty cool. And there are other small differences besides. Like this one has a very squared feeling stock. And a lot of these differences weren't just changes at Kokura or Tokyo, but also other factories that were starting to kind of put these into production. But let's begin with Kokura, since we've kind of already mentioned them. Why not? Dust cover on this one fits a little tight. I can't remember if it matches or not. Not bad, but yeah, quality still stays up. But yeah, Kokura switched over production 1932, 33, in that time frame, and would produce till about 1941. And they would turn out just shy of 500,000, being the primary producer after Tokyo, who, as I mentioned in the first video, built 2 million Type 38 long rifles, plus the carbines. Next to kind of come online, in a factory that will become more and more important, and the reason I suggested in the first video we might call this in Nagoya, was, well, Nagoya. They were really becoming prominent in this era. They've been around. And they would ramp up production around the same era, 32, 33, and they would build rifles through 42, so just a hair after Kokura, and they would build a little over 310,000. So far less than Kokura, but still a substantial number. And those would be the two primary makers in Japan, but they would also try their manufacturing on the mainland over there. In occupied China, Manchuria, they would start up production at what we know as Mukden, which is the Hoden arsenal. And the fun fact is the Chinese had actually been doing unlicensed copies and clones, various warlords of Arisaka's, even the Type 30. It's a whole thing. Even they copied Mausers. But either way, they had attempted. But the Japanese decided to kind of try their hand at making them in China around 1937, and kind of rolling through, it's hard to say, 42 to 44. It really is vague. And they would build just under 150,000 long rifles at the Mukden arsenal. And finally, there would be a batch in 1942 at Jinsen or Yinsen, Incheon and Korea, which was obviously occupied. It only lasted not even a year, and they built only about 14,000 rifles. So, not what I'd consider successful, but then again, they had other things going on their mind that we'll talk about later. So those are your kind of production numbers. And of course, the carbine, it wouldn't be left behind either. So early and late, side by side, just little differences. And while the earlies would all be more or less at Tokyo, maybe slight changes over the years, you get to the later ones, Kokura, Nagoya, Mukden, there can be some differences in like wood, quality of bluing. And of course, these are produced in series, although the series system would be a little different, say, before World War I, after World War I, and especially when we get into World War II. They will all have two pieces of wood back here. The new butt plate really would help. Again, the change on the safety is kind of interesting. One of the more obvious ways. The Takedown is a larger checkered piece, a little flatter here on the later one. So that could have been one small economy to save just a tiny bit of machining time. On the other hand, the front sight protector just makes sense. Not just to protect your sight, but also to have a common sight picture between rifle and carbine. Just, standardization. Why not? And as I said in the first video, these were fitted with both assembly and serial numbers. But as we go away from Tokyo and get into Nagoya and Kokura production, the assembly system is long gone now. And we're just doing serial numbers. And while several different things can be serialized on an Arisaka, the critical ones will be your bolt body, and your safety serial matching is actually important so it works properly. Same with your top cover. These are serialized. Your firing pin typically is. And a lot of times your barrel band bayonet lug will be serialized. Again, different makers, different times. It's hard to say. While there was definitely a standard, each factory kind of did their own thing too, especially once they started manufacturing over in mainland Asia. The Type 38 carbine was not left behind. Unfortunately, I don't have an example of a later production. I just have this one right now. I've seen them. Very similar changes, what you'd expect. Peep sight, cupped butt plate, concave safety. You get the dealio. I actually really like the 38 carbine. It's a very handy little gun. Japanese thought so too. Kokura, though, only produced a few of these for a couple of years. From about 1938 to 1941, they made just under 50,000. Remember, the original Tokyo made about 210,000. But that's because the primary maker was Nagoya at this time. Starting around 1935 and running through 42, same with the rifle, they would build almost the same as Tokyo, over 205,000, 206, some say, in that ballpark. So that kind of explains why. Now, while Jensen or Jensen would not tackle these, Mukden would. Beginning in that same period, 38, running through 42 to 44, they would build over 50,000. So technically more than Kokura. 50, 52, somewhere in that thing. So they were still building these. And that brought the total number well over 500,000, about 520,000 Type 38 carbines. And that pushed the number of Type 38 rifles and carbines and everything to nearly 3.6 million. Now, one might question if that also includes some of the earlier variants that were made in small numbers. Who knows? Either way, not a small, insignificant number. And, of course, by the 30s, Japan is occupying and fighting and all that, and they need more guns. And an interesting concept comes out of Nagoya. Carbines like this, as we mentioned, have a 19-inch barrel, overall length of about 38 inches, and are just a hair over 7 pounds. But as you see, production is a little lower rate in the 1930s. There's a few reasons for this. But you know what they do have? They've got millions of the long rifle, some of them new, but some well-worn. For the first thing, Nagoya was charged with refurbishing, updating in some cases, existing guns. But they were also given the task of making about 100,000, give or take. No one knows it all, but that's the best estimate of these. The so-called Type 38 Cavalry rifle. This is a regular 38, not a new production. Updated by Nagoya. They might change the rear sight if it didn't already have it. This one's an interesting mix. It has the flat butt plate, but it has the peep sight, and it has the concave safety. But note the sling swivels are on the bottom. That's because these had their barrels shortened to either 24 or 25 inches. And I'm not being vague, it's just you see both versions out there today. So I don't know if there was a change or they did both, whatever. Of course, the cleaning rods were cut down, the forearm, the cap reinstalled. It does have a protected front sight. This was kind of what Italy did with some of their Carcano carbines in this era too. You know, waste not, want not. Because if you clean a bore a lot, or just through use in the field, sometimes you have a good bore, but the crown, the muzzle area is shot or worn out. Well, cut it back. You know, same thing goes with counterboring. So they cut these down into what was essentially China's first short rifles, something that really had become popular in World War I. The British and the Americans kind of led the way. The Germans acceded to it with the Kar 98K and so on and so forth. So these cavalry rifles have the bottom sling mounts and are just, you know, cut down, a little lighter, a little handier rifles. This thing weighs somewhere between, I'd say, 8.25 pounds. Yeah. And it's about 6 inches, so half a foot shorter than a regular long rifle. And these were primarily intended for use in China, occupation forces, cavalry, of course, just to give them a handy gun because there weren't enough carbines to go around. And of course they would see use for a number of years. And Nagoya seems to have stopped doing this cut down project around 1940, 1941, give or take. We're kind of guessing, but it's a neat variation, and I definitely wanted to bring it out because it really set a trend for the future. Here are the three sizes, types of Type 38 that were available in the 1930s. Infantry rifle, cavalry carbine, cavalry rifle, short rifle. Switch them around a bit so you can really see the differences here. How much length we really saved and didn't. I have to wonder because one of the complaints about 6.5, while it was an accurate round, was penetration. You'd think a little extra barrel length wouldn't hurt for maybe getting a little more ass behind it, as J-Ro would say. So I don't have any data on velocity, but I wonder if it's noticeably different between the three. Kind of interesting. I would say with the 1930s, no one is seriously thinking that a 31-inch barrel is required. Short rifles have proven that with smokeless powder, especially the second and third generations, you don't need a barrel too much over 20, 25 inches. Okay, 19, little short, but it's a relatively short little cartridge. The reason we had such long barrels in the beginning, aside from just bayonet use and a good sight radius, it was a bit of a holdover from the black powder era where longer barrels really did help with range. Plus, when smokeless powder came in, it was such a revolutionary new thing. There was an idea that infantries would be fighting at, 500, 600 meters, even 1,000 meters. But by the 1930s, World War II era too, it was very clear that fighting was still in that like 150 to 300 meter range on average, even sometimes much less. Plus, with mechanization taking over from either your own feet or horseback, it just changed the need. And the Cavalry carbine is pretty cool for that. The Type 44. It really had become a popular gun, and Tokyo continued to make these really on paper and refurbishing existing ones to the very end, building about 55,000, and they were all of this here first variation. Has pretty typical features. We already talked about the butt plate, notch rear sight, convex safety, and this bayonet housing. And it did good, but you see this just only overlaps at the very edge of the stock and can be a little delicate. In fact, mine has a crack here in the wood. Nothing happened, it's just time. This is an area that's not very enforced. I thought about correcting it, but as I said in video 1, the screws are staked in, and I don't want to do that. I'm afraid if I try to get in there and correct it, it'll make more of a trouble than it's worth. I need to kind of get in there with maybe like a small syringe or something and just inject a little bit of glue and clamp it. But it goes to show you there was a little bit of a weak spot, and they took bayonet fighting seriously. And so not only did production continue, but we did get a new generation. Kokora would pick up production, and they would work on ways of strengthening the housing. And they would build so-called series or Type 2s, but only about 8,000 of them. It was a transitional. And then they would very quickly in the 30s go over to the Type 3, Series 3, Variation 3, Type 44. And that's what we have here with a very different edge. Notice there's only just this little bit of wood to make sure on top, and then it really cups it all around. It goes in, the screws are moved further apart. It's just a longer, stronger housing. Drain hole. Told you they added those. There. They still kept the notch rear sight, which is a little interesting, not going to the peep. Although these do have the concave safety. And while the butt plate, except for this little nubbin on it, looks the same trap door here, they actually changed the inside a bit there too. Instead of 2 separate holes for the cleaning rods, there's just kind of a larger compartment. It both sped up production, and what they were having trouble with was the rods maybe getting stuck in there in the cold and everything. So yeah, and Kokora would make 13,000 more of this variation. So total of 26,000 from Kokora, on top of the 55,000 from Tokyo, and then Nagoya would take over and get in, and they would build another 13,000 or so of the third variation. I don't think there was a Nagoya second. If there was, let me know. So basically 4 variations in these of note, bringing the total production up to just shy of 92,000. Not huge at all. It's a specialty gun, but the Japanese liked them. Guys bringing them back liked them. It's a unique design. So we're kind of lucky that a lot of them do survive in America today. In fact, I did have a second pattern, Series 2 type variant if you want. But I sold it because even though it was a cool transitional, they're bringing good money, and the difference is just right in between those two right up here. Needs must. And even though production would end with these in 1942, they would continue to be refurbished and recycled. Early on, the bulk would be used in China in rough areas, kind of like the Cavalry rifle, same principle. In fact, the puppet government in Manchuria, the Manchukuo government, used quite a few of these. But they were never made in China or Korea, just in Japan. But after World War II kicked off, after Pearl Harbor, more and more would get shifted to the Pacific, because not a bad little island hopping gun here, if I do say so myself. And they would continue to be refurbished. And after that, when supply lines started to get cut, they would go back to the home islands to get refurbished and then never leave again. But of course, they were also wanting to keep guns there because they were expecting to have to fight an invasion of the Allies. So a lot of them do get turned over to soldiers, sailors after the war that are in Japan. And that's how a lot of them get brought back. It's also why a lot of them had the mum scrubbed off. Usually, and this is just a kind of a little bit of a rule of thumb, but it's not 100% true, just something to kind of go by. If you see the mum is taken off by what is clearly a grinder, a machine, just scooped out, that was done by the Japanese before handing it over. However, if you see it kind of hacked out, crossed out, chipped away at by something like a bayonet tip or maybe just a chisel, typically those were more captured guns that Americans got their hands on one way or another. I'm not going to say battlefield pickup. I have a feeling a lot got one in card games more than anything else. And people have all these stories about General MacArthur and all that. Maybe they're true, maybe they're not. Exactly what happened was left to time. And both deployed. The length seems the same, which confused me because a lot of online places said that the bayonet assembly was lengthened a bit between first, second, and third. But I think, and that was just reading online, they were really talking about the whole assembly or this part back here, which is definitely lengthened. You can tell a second pattern because essentially they just have this and they have a little kind of extension here for the third. Well, this one doesn't have the extension, it just kind of comes straight down here. So each time the screws are moved further apart and there's a little more metal. And as again, this one they added a drain hole under the handguard. This one they didn't. I don't know when those came in, probably before, but yeah. Updated safety, and of course the trap door, as I mentioned, is a little different butt plate. Just, working with the design. And I could definitely see this as being a useful tool in mainland China when equipment's at a premium. You don't want to carry around a whole lot. Plus, it's just a less lethal way of intimidating the locals or whatnot to kind of poke them into doing what you want without just shooting them. Not that the Japanese were always that worried about it, but still, this isn't a super sharp bayonet. You wouldn't want to get run through with it, but you could do some good butt poking with it. So I have a feeling they were used for that. Also, maybe this is kind of an ad hoc tool. I could see a few different kind of weird ways of using it. Don't know, but I could definitely understand why that was a popular thing to have around. Here's the early and the late Type 44 on the table. The stocks are cut a little different. I would say this one a little smoother, nicer, just for fun. Hit the original carbine and the cavalry rifle above, just to show you overall lengths. We looked at a carbine with the Type 30 bayonet mounted before. Of course, it's nice to be able to fold these up and not have a Type 32 saber in your hands. And if you need a bayonet, it's pretty handy and right there. But with that, I think we're ready to kind of dive in to this video's featured attraction, don't you? Kind of what we've been building up to, and the true second generation of Arisaka. This so far has kind of been a little bit of a transitional phase, but a very important one. Keep in mind, production would continue for the 6.5mm guns through 41, 42 at the very least, and they would absolutely be used in frontline service to the end of the war. But there were some problems with it. Some that had been haunting it since the very beginning, and some that really just became apparent as they were fighting in Manchuria, trying to occupy Korea, and also just observing what the world was doing, because Japan was very aware of what European nations were up to. Good old Arkansas weather. It is now turned gray and cold. But the show must go on. Much like Chinese forces in Manchuria occupied China. Now, don't get me wrong. Japan was part of the Axis. Pearl Harbor happened. They're not the good guys. However, they were done a little dirty with first the Washington Naval Treaty and the London Naval Treaty. They kind of felt like they should be treated equal to the major powers, the US, Britain. And instead they were kind of treated like the rest of the people, the regional powers. They felt like, hey, we were on their side. Now, they didn't fight directly in Europe in the war. They felt slighted. But at the same time, there was, of course, growing imperial ambitions within Japan, so you never know what's true insult, what's pretext. Another thing, of course, was they were looking at potential resource shortages. Oil, petroleum is probably the biggest one, rubber, steel, also some other alloys could potentially become it's an ally nation. So they'd already been in Korea. They go into Japan. It starts off kind of more low-key in the 20s. And by 31, 32, it's pretty much a full-fledged invasion on the mainland. And it would go from there. And, of course, this would lead to closer ties with rising powers in Italy and then Germany for fascism. And their switchover would happen. Now, as we talked about when we looked at the cavalry rifle here, they had the Type 38 and its 6.5 millimeter in China. But while it was a soft shooting gun, plenty accurate, had a lot to recommend it, it wasn't always penetrating light armor at all, or even like thick winter clothing. At the same time, they had another gun, the Type 92 machine gun, which fired a relatively new to Japan 7.7 by 58 cartridge. It was a rebated rim, a rimless round. Basically, it was a British 303, which is 7.7 by 56 rimmed, just with the rim taken away, and a little more modernization. It's often compared to 8mm Mauser, which is what the Chinese mostly were using, but the truth is it's kind of closer to the British. Either way, they realized that that's working a lot better. Well, let's just rebarrel some Type 38s to fire the 7.7 round. And they did some experiments with that. This action is plenty strong, plenty robust enough to fire something more powerful than 6.5 mil. But logistically, it wasn't that effective. Also, they knew war was coming, and they needed to be able to build guns faster and to consume fewer resources. And this gun is a product of the late 19th, early 20th century, where you have machined parts everywhere. You've got barrel spring, band springs. Up here too. It's a quality rifle. And the receiver forging, while very, very durable, it's not the fastest to make. So, hey, if we can have a gun firing 7.7, also we can make faster, that'd be great. But also, as I mentioned a minute ago, Japan is keeping up with the latest and greatest in technology around the world. So they want to have some new features, and they want to have it proofed as best they can against the rigors of the tropical environments, the islands, saltwater, and also the icy mountain areas in Korea and China and the like. So they also need it to be modern, at least as modern as a bolt action can be in the 1930s. And just as Nagoya was charged with doing these, the work for this new rifle would also be conducted at Nagoya. And as far as I know, there wasn't just like one lead designer of note. It just seems like it was legitimately a team. And since it really was taken straight from the Type 38, credit can be given to Nambu with inspiration from Colonel Arisaka. But at this point, once you take the 6.5 millimeter out, his contribution's pretty much over. So they worked on it in 1937, 1938. And then in 1939, it went through final testing, and it was approved that year. The year, Type 99. Or Type 99, T99, or if you prefer, Model 99. It could be kind of translated in any of those ways. Now, our previous rifles, Type 30, 38, 44, were named for the year in the reign of the Meiji Emperor. At this point, we have his grandson on the throne, Hirohito. There was the Tosho Emperor in between, but no rifles of note for there. But they switched the system over. Instead of naming it for the Emperor's year, it's named after the traditional Japanese calendar, which 1939 at this point translated to the year 2599. And this may not be the Type 99 you're familiar with. This is the long rifle. Very much like a Type 38 dimensionally. 50 inches overall, 31.5-inch barrel, weighing about 9 pounds, really. It's 8 point. They took weight off and added weight on. It's hard to say, but of course it is firing the new 7.5 by 58 cartridge in a 5-shot bolt-action rifle, and there are more changes than first you might really notice. But first, it does still have the bottom sling swivels. We have basically the same type of cupped butt plate in design as the 38. We have the same type of top cover, dust cover, although it is actually a new, different pattern. It's a little more simplified for production. Same takedown catch. Again, a little bit simplified though. We still have a opening floor plate, but they made really one great change. It's hinged in the front now, so it doesn't come off. It just opens up. I completely understand why they did that. Also seems to me the trigger guard's maybe slightly larger. That's just maybe me. This version, the long, has a short upper handguard with exposed barrel, protected front sight, long cleaning rod, although with the 38 you pressed in on the retainer for the band to let your rod go. Here we have a spring-loaded button, and that's because the bayonet lug barrel band is no longer retained with a spring. It's actually retained with screws, front and back, as is the rear band. It's got a screw. That was one of the many simplifications. Others would be that this band and this top cover, part of the and butt plate and floor plate and trigger guard are actually made from stamped steel or sheet steel, not traditional machining forging. So that helps. The bolt really hasn't changed, except it has one of the several upgrades. So we have a long rifle. We have a few ways we've simplified, streamlined its production. So as a 2-piece stock. But we've also added some neat, nifty features. As I mentioned, the bolt has one of note. The face, where the cartridge goes, is chrome plated, as is the bore. This was the first widespread, full military adoption gun to come standard with the chrome plated bore. I mean, at first, chamber face there. And that was to protect against corrosion, the environment, salt water, all that stuff. So that's pretty cool. Another very obvious one with these are the aircraft sights. Flip it up, lower it down, and adjust it up. That's the highest it'll go on there. And this is a very similar concept to the volley sets on the British infield, you know, mass infantry. Now, yeah, they not only weren't expecting to shoot down like modern American fighters, this wasn't even designed with fighting the Americans in mind. This was to target low-flying, slow-moving, old-school biplanes, maybe even dirigibles in China. And again, one or two people shooting at it, they still didn't think it would do much. But if you get 50, 100 guys trying to pop off at a reconnaissance plane or something, even if you don't hit it much, you're probably going to spook the flyer away. Again, maybe not the most practical, but it made sense for the time. By the way, it's a peep sight, just like on the late 38s. And of course, another feature I have to talk about is this monopod. Not many standard military rifles come with a monopod. And it's just to do exactly what you'd expect, to stabilize fire. But it has a secondary purpose when it's folded up. It actually acts as a rest for your rifle. Say you're up against a barrier, so your wood isn't just directly on it. And it does have springs. It's pretty good. It's a feature. It's interesting. The action, the safety is still the same, checkered safety. And this particular example was made at Nagoya. They had a relatively new factory at Torimatsu. Before that, they'd been producing guns at the old Chigusa factory. And these were put into production in 1940. And Nagoya did not make many of the long rifles. In fact, they only made about 8,000. So they were out of production very quick there. Now, there was another factory that would go into production around the same exact time, Toyo Kogyo. And they were a commercial factory in Hiroshima. But they produced under the supervision of Kokura, who took over from Tokyo Arsenal. And they would produce in what was known as the Series 35 or 35th series, whereas Nagoya would produce these in the 0 series or no series. And basically, a Japanese series at this point consisted of 100,000 guns, because they wanted to keep serials reasonable, between 1 and 5 digits. So they essentially use prefix-suffix systems. Of course, with the long rifle, there is just one series of each. And while TK would make more long rifles, they would only build about 30,000, meaning only a little over 38,000 came out, with Nagoya being the rare one. I did have a Toyo Kogyo long rifle once upon a time, but when this one came around, I moved it and kept this one. Now, I will say that the TK guns have absolutely gorgeous bluing, and this is me, a blind guy, saying it. It was just, you could feel it. And of course, what that really means is the polishing on the metal was just super high grade. Nagoya here made a nice gun, but it was more military grade bluing. Otherwise, they were pretty much the same guns. TK did use the old assembly plus serial number system. Kokura kind of inspired that, and you'll see them using it too. But Nagoya, being a more modern setup, was just straight serials all the time. Typically, you had your receiver, your bolt body, your safety, firing pin, extractor sometimes was, especially early on, and the front band would usually have 3 digits on it. This one does right there. So not a ton of parts serialized. Interestingly, I don't believe they ever serialized the stocks. So they each used a little bit of a different numbering system. So if you have a TK long and you see a different number that's not the serial, don't worry too much. It's probably just your assembly number. I should also point out that the rear sights are different. Nagoya calibrated theirs up to 1,500 meters, but TK calibrated theirs up to 1,700, and I don't know that anyone knows why. Also note that the wings have 2 notches and 1 notch. And they have a little spring in there, they spring into place. Drain hole in the stock. So while they definitely wanted to see if they could make this a little cheaper, they didn't want to sacrifice quality. But they only made these for about 9 months in total, even far fewer at Nagoya. For comparison, the late Type 38 long rifle and the early limited production Type 99 long rifle, you can see that they're essentially the same exact length. Then we have the Cavalry rifle and 99 standard, both done by Nagoya, and the 99 long is just ever so slightly longer, not by much. Again, the barrel length on the Cavalry rifle was never 100% standardized because they were cut downs. But yeah, you can really see the kind of the similarities of these two at first, but also just, you know, where they saved money and adopted some new manufacturing technology. You can really see it in the way they made the receivers. The 99 receiver is still very, very strong, but more simplified, comparatively speaking. But they made a lot of improvements. Here we go. This is kind of the quintessential Arisaka from World War II, that when people start collecting Japanese guns that they want. And it took me years to kind of pick this one, and it's not perfect. None of them are, because they're old. And I just have one exactly like this. No reason to have every single one. And to be fair, the early ones were pretty uniform. But yeah, this is the so-called short rifle, or just standard rifle, frankly, because it was the standard. But that wasn't the intention. Originally, they were going to kind of do the same thing as with the Type 38. Long infantry rifle, short cavalry carbine, and it looks, and this is speculation, but it looks like if they were to do a 7.7 carbine, it was going to be very much based on the Type 44. So maybe attached bayonet. So a 19-inch barrel. But they found out 2 things. One, the long rifle, with all that stuff, was heavy and long. And really, there was not a lot of benefit to it. Plus, it used up resources more. 2, testing the carbine. Yeah, it was light and handy, but with the 7.7 mil cartridge, the lighter weight, shorter length of the carbine, it produced a lot more muzzle flash than 6.5 and a lot more felt recoil. And it wasn't that the Japanese were wimps, it's just, you know, more recoil means more time to get back on target, and more flash blinds the shooter, might give away the position. It was probably louder too. And it was just felt like, what's the point of having 2 separate guns, both of which have some drawbacks? Meanwhile, those cavalry rifles that Nagoya cut down from 38s with those 25-inch barrels were really doing well. And the British were doing well with the Enfields in America and all that. So they decided, you know what, we'll do the same thing. We'll go to a kind of universal rifle here. This has an overall length of just over 44 inches and a barrel of just under 26 inches. It is a weird, even in millimeters, it's kind of a weird number. What can you do? And depending on the make, model, and when you go, these things range anywhere from 8 pounds to about 8.25, give or take. As you'll see, different makers and different variations kind of change it up. So it's considerably lighter than the long rifle, and only a pound and a half heavier than the carbine. Still a 5-shot mag, mechanically all the same. We still have the aircraft sights, but note the wing now just has the bottom notch, not the 2 on top, like on the rifle, long rifle. Just a little bit different styling there. Kind of compensating for the nearly 6-inch shorter barrel. And the bipod 2, or monopod rather, has a different spring system and is actually a little bit shorter compared with the long rifle. Not by a whole lot. We still have screws here. The rear screw is actually 2 small screws so that the cleaning rod can pass through, and then the upper here. Yeah. It still has the retaining button. Finger grooves in the stock. And another change and an improvement they had even over the Type 38 Cavalry rifle, we have side sling mounts now. These just make a lot more sense for warfare in the 1940s. Note the split barrel band and the lug where this goes. Also, for much later, note that the side adjustment, even though it goes up all the way, it settles here. The reason it was done that with this kind of thing was just to make room for the things. And here's our dust cover. This one I do believe matches, so it fits pretty good. See, it doesn't rattle. Actually at all. It's better than I remember. But it also moves very smoothly. So it goes to show you when one is actually matched to the gun, it fits fine. We have the chrysanthemum and the year mark, or the model year marking on the receiver up there. And again on the side we have the serial and the series marking. Now of course these were made at Nagoya. In late 40 they started, and again series 0, or the no series. And through series 1 and series 2, so the first roughly 300,000 in production, nothing would really change. And series 3 would continue the trend, except they did make one critical and important improvement. This is still a 2-piece stock with a splice back here. And on the first guns, it runs more or less horizontal. The problem is when they switch the swivel over to the side of the stock, the line essentially goes right through it here. Well, you can understand why screwing that on that way could potentially lead to separation issues, splitting issues, stress issues. So in Series 3, they went to more of a diagonal cut where it went around the swivel. It's one of those small things you wouldn't think about when you're designing, but once you get in the field, it matters. Like I said, this has a blued finish, and the wood, to kind of weatherproof and treat it, has a very nice Uroshi lacquer. Actually, multiple layers, hand applied. They have a very nice texture, and it was a good finish because it's held up well over the years. These aren't known for flaking or whatnot, and guns like this that had the finish, the wood still has vibrancy and life. And keep in mind too, Japan wasn't always using the hardest, most durable wood. Sometimes they had softer. Series 4 is a little weird. We'll get to that in a minute, but for the most part, it continues on like the first 4 itself. So the 5th series, so getting up to basically the first, 500,000 built it in Nagoya. But Nagoya was absolutely not the only maker, even at the beginning. Nearly half of all Type 99 production would come from Nagoya. But the idea in 1939-1940 was to completely re-equip and expand the Army, also supply to the Navy if there was leftover rifles, but Army always got priority. And so they knew they would have to produce more from as many factories as possible. So you ended up having a total of 7 manufacturers in Japan, and then 2 more on the mainland, 1 in Korea, 1 in China. So a total of 9, plus subcontractors and assemblers and makers of other parts and accessories and things like that. But as we already talked about, the first nigh on 500,000 from Nagoya were of the standard 99 pattern. We already talked about Toyo Kogyo producing the long rifle, so it should be no surprise that they soon switched over to the short in 1941. But it's interesting, they only made 2 complete full series of just standard Type 99s. Series 30, yeah, they went back, it's strange, and Series 31. And they were a good chunk through Series 32, still looking like this. But before that series is over, they would make changes. And as I mentioned, they were under the supervision, auspices, inspector of Kokura. And while Kokura would never make long rifles, they would make short rifles. And they would start with Series 20, and all the way through Series 22, and almost all the way through Series 23, it would be the standard pattern. Interestingly, early on, Kokura would also use assembly numbers plus serial numbers, but they would quickly get away from that practice within the first or second of their series. By the way, the series, they were assigned as blocks to the companies, the firms, early on. For example, there are no like Series 13, 14, etc. in the teens because they were left open for Nagoya or someone else to take. So, yeah, you can't just count series and think that's where they go. Nagoya, Kokura, and Toyo Kogyo were the largest and main producers of the Type 99 from beginning to end. And so they were the ones that produced the early pattern, with a few exceptions. They were the producers. And again, Japan wanted to build enough to just replace all the Type 38s. And they really planned to win the war against America in the first year. First 6 months would be great. And by win, they basically just meant get America to the negotiating table and just negotiate a beneficial agreement so that America could focus on Europe and leave Japan to do its thing in the Pacific and make their empire. Well, it didn't work out that way. In fact, a lot of miscalculations were made. And it's in evidence with the fighter planes, the battleships, the tanks, really the tanks, but of course also the rifles. And this is where Arisaka collecting Type 99 especially gets fun, because yeah, the early ones are pretty uniform. There were a few tiny differences, like between a Nagoya and a Kokura. For example, off the top of my head, the bipod, or monopod rather, is slightly different. TK guns have a slightly different type of either shellac or wood, because it tends to be more of a reddish color. But that's small fry. And different places for cereal or not. No. Towards the end of 42 and moving forward with a rapid clip, the differences become more and more pronounced. And while production started off pretty uniform, as the war went on, each factory really started to do its own thing. So, remember how I said earlier that Japan was looking to see what Europe was doing. And one thing they saw were paratroopers. And they were updating their Air Force, both with the Army and the Navy. and the Navy had special landing forces too, what have you. The problem was, even though they started forming paratroopers and even had some operations in China, everything before Pearl Harbor, they took the German approach of dropping the rifle or machine gun or whatever in a separate container, meaning that it could fall close or far from the paratrooper and it was not always gettable. The paratroopers themselves really only dropped with this. It was a new pistol at the time, but not exactly adequate. The Type 94 Nembu, a 6-shot locked breech gun firing the 8mm, looking for a pocket, and it's, there we go, 8mm Nembu round. Now they had improved the power of this round a little bit in the early 30s, but it's still not exactly strong. Of course, you have the disconnect safety. Of course, you can override it, but in that. And I do think the Type 94 is a much maligned pistol considering what it really is. But it is just a pistol. And that left the paratroopers just not in a good position. Plus, they didn't have a ton of these. So, the Tera project was begun, and it was actually joint between the Army and Navy cooperation. And essentially, Army Research Laboratory would work on something for a takedown, something that the paratrooper could keep with him when he jumped, both safely and securely. And of course, this was done in conjunction with Nagoya, who at the time was just going from the Type 99 long rifle to the Type 99 short rifle, standard rifle. And they had two proposals. One was known as the Type 1 takedown rifle, or Tera rifle. And it was essentially take a Type 38 carbine in 6.5mm, cut the stock off back here, and install a door hinge. So it could be folded over itself, saving this much in length, meaning with the 19-inch barrel, it could be strapped on a leg, and it could be quickly deployed out for service. So that was one offering. It wasn't well accepted. Now, they did send some. They built, I've seen anywhere from 300 to 500 Type 1s sent to the Army and Navy. I don't know if they ever really made it into combat, but they definitely saw testing. And they found some problems. For one, the hinge wasn't super strong back here. It also had a lot of sticky yaddy bits. I've seen them before. They do look like door hinges. It's nothing fancy. And for another, and the Navy really didn't like this. It was returning to 6.5mm, and they'd had enough of that with their Type Is. So they really said, no, we need a 7.7, and they've already, with testing earlier with this 19-inch barrel on a 7.7, too much flash and recoil. It wasn't a workable design, according to testing done in 1941. So what about the second design? Well, those who followed the channel know this was one of my just crazy COVID times finds, and it was a local pickup. This is the so-called Type 0 or Type 100 Tera rifle. And, well, it's a true takedown. And these are not easily found because they made 500, maybe 600. Some are Navy marked, some are Army marked. And what they did here, so there's a wedge under here. This one, there's a spring in there, but this one's got a lot of Cosmo. Just gonna open this up to kind of make it easier. The gun's still gunky and it's cold out. So you push it on this ledge, you hear the little click. Now I would advise, if you have one, to grab the metal either here or here and not the wood. Like my wood is kind of shrunk and got a little wobbly over the years. And then this just pulls out. It's a interrupted thread system. Pretty neat. Setting it down carefully. And you can see the front here. This is the nub that holds it in, and then your threads. Oh, Cosmo. Cosmo in the cold. And if you needed to further compact your gun, the bolt handle unscrews. There are small little teeth that kind of catch in there to, in theory, keep it from unscrewing itself. But really, that's a tiny part to have in a battlefield. Nevertheless, with it removed, you have a very flush system. And the idea is essentially you would carry one half, and they're roughly of equal length on each leg. Look at that Cosmo in there. And of course this is in 7.7, so it gives them that. This was preferred. They did testing, and this was definitely, of the two offerings that the labs and Nagoya gave them, the way they thought they should go. Of course, by this point, the war in the Pacific is going hard, but development's underway. And they kept the general two-piece design based on the 99. And by summer of that year, they had some advanced prototypes to work with, which were sent for testing in September, October at the Army Proving Grounds, and were generally accepted as being much better and good enough. They had a few notes, reworked it a bit, refined the manufacturing, and it was finally accepted and ordered into immediate, we need them yesterday, production May of 1943. This is, of course, the Type 2 Tera rifle, Takedown paratrooper rifle, named for the year 1942, Showa. And in the general sense, it is the same as the Type 0, just with a different mechanism here. You have what I kind of think of as a grenade thing there. Two-piece. Now this spins, but it's actually attached to a wedge. If you see I put my finger on it, it doesn't rotate. And the wedge actually tilts itself. So pretty clever. It just pulls right off. Now you might think, well, that's weaker. No, it's simpler, but you just have a massive lug under the barrel. And that corresponds with this massive steel wedge in here. And it's honestly kind of a self-tightening design where it pushes up, and if it wears, it just pushes up harder. And it does screw in like so, giving a pretty tight interface. And you can fold that over. And we actually still have that nubbin from the Type 0, but now it's just a fixed kind of indexing spot because we don't have to rotate the barrel anymore. See, it's pretty secure. You just slam that in there. This one gets a little sticky on the thing, and I don't like to over tighten it. It will go all the way, but then it gets a little stuck. And it is pretty secure for its age. And unlike the Type Zeros and Type 1s, which are just modified from existing guns, these were purpose-built at Nagoya's Torimatsu facility. I've never really seen a series name for them. They're just the Type 2. And so they do have a few features all their own, but they're pretty standard. They have a top cover, and they have checkered safety. They have a standard plumb bolt handle. They did continue testing removable bolt handles, but it just was not workable. Steel butt plate. Almost a standard rear swivel, but it has this cutout up here in the stock. And notice that it does not have a place for a monopod on the barrel band. It's still the split style. But yeah. But we do have the aircraft sights. Pretty well standard. And we do have a push button cleaning rod, although it is unique to this gun. It's slightly shorter and protected front sight. Finger grooves. Notice the stock is a little more bulgy here to interface with all this. And this does rely on assembly numbers and serial numbers. Obviously, you want to match your front half and your back half. And these were produced through 43 and 44 and perhaps into 45. Now, they definitely made more of these compared with the others, but authors, researchers kind of argue I've seen anywhere from 20,000 to 25,000. I tend to kind of settle in the 22 to 24 range. And most of them, even though they were built mid-war and later, look like this. But you get towards the end, last few thousand at least, you lose a few features like the AA sights. Also, the wood finish and the bluing definitely goes down in quality. They're never as rough as a Last Ditch, not even close, but getting there. But they were produced late enough that monopods weren't even a consideration. Why would they be? So they worked really hard and probably made one of the best takedown rifles of the war. Problem is, by this point, they really weren't doing airborne operations. By 43 was a bit of a quiet year for the war in the Pacific, and then 44 was Japan on the back foot fighting a defensive war. There are accounts of these being at the Battle of Leyte, but that's really about it. They didn't make a splash, and of course, with 20-some-odd thousand made in total, what were they going to do? Just too little, too late. We see this a lot with a lot of other Japanese hardware. They just waited too long, and the need was kind of gone by the time they got them. But it's a really cool collectible. Has always been desired, and quite a few GIs picked these up and brought them home because, well, they were easy to bring home. For the same reason paratroopers could easily stuff them in leg sacks and bags, so could GIs. And one final word. If you're looking for a Type 1, the folding T-38 carbine, there have been some very authentic looking reproductions done in America. Very authentic. So caveat emptor. And just because someone says, oh, I got it back in the 80s, it must be original. No, they were doing very good reproductions in the 60s and 70s through the 90s, so that doesn't really mean anything. And I don't know that the people that originally did them were trying to fake them. They probably just thought it would be fun to do, but after it gets passed through a few hands, that, hey, this is a repro made by Mr. So-and-so, sometimes gets lost in translation. So, be aware. But I don't think any repros of these have been done that I'm aware of. But what do you think? I just thought it'd be fun to kind of end on the takedown guns because they're very popular, and understandably so. You know, I started off thinking this would be a long but one-part video, then two. Now it's going to be three because there's so much to talk about with Last Ditch production in just those not even 2 years. So much happened. So I had to end on a high note with the paratroopers. And to be fair, This is certainly something you'd rather be handled when dropping into a hostile situation versus that pistol. Now, keeping that pistol as a backup makes sense. The Type 94 is a fantastic little backup gun for its era. Again, it's much maligned. They're a lot better and cooler and more forward-thinking than they get credit for. But I wouldn't want it as my primary firearm, that's for dang sure. But it's interesting that they were innovating with the Type 2 here, even as the transitional guns were going into full swing at Nagoya, Kokura, and TK, as well as the others. And you have to give Japan credit. They kept on, even when it was quite clear they really shouldn't. That's where we're going to end today. But next time, we'll kind of look at the end of the war and all the crazy variations that came from it. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And I hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving and good Black Friday. And let's talk some Japanese in the comments. Again, I'm doing this video because it's just really something I'm interested in, so I hope that is conveyed to you. If you could, let me know. If you'd like to sign up on Patreon, that's cool. I really appreciate it. If not, just liking, sharing, subscribing, or doing super thanks over here helps a lot too. Whatever you can do is great. So until then, this is Misha. I'll catch you next time.